Hello and welcome back to Journey into DevOps, and in this video we're going to be looking at users and groups and permissions. Some of the things we'll be doing are things that you've seen in my other videos, but we're going to go deep into how the internal workings work. So starting off with users, you do know that we can create multiple users for our computer. Of course, we had created Peter previously, and I am signed in as Dare, and we can keep on creating as many users as we want because obviously Linux is a multi-user operating system, and for every company that does IT there is always need to onboard new users from time to time. And so having a solution that is able to manage multiple users at the same time and create separation of responsibilities, it just makes sense to be able to implement such a separation. And if we have a look at the folder called home in the root directory, you can see that each of the users have separated directories. And if we go into Dare, we can see Dare has got a couple of folders and files in there, and Peter on the other hand has nothing because yes, we didn't create anything for it. And even if we create multiple other users, let's say we created about 10 other users, none of them will be able to get into each other's directory, and that's absolutely very good. But the next concern will be, what if we have, let's say, 50 users who all of them are developers, and there's need to assign common permission to each and every one of them? Well, it doesn't make sense to go into each of the users and start giving them individual permissions. That's where the whole concept around groups come in. So I could just create one group, assign a bunch of permissions to that group, and then assign all the 50 users, the developers, into that group. So basically, if I create a user, I could just assign that user to that group, and automatically that user will get assigned every permissions that has been assigned to that group. And we're going to see that in action very soon. One thing I do want to quickly point out is the fact that there is one user in the Linux system that is a super user. Think about it as the administrator. Even in Windows-based computers, there's one user called the administrator who has permissions to do anything about anything on the system. The equivalent of that in Linux is the root user. And if I do ID on root, you can see, sure enough, that user does exist. And with a root user, you can do anything. Bear in mind that it is bad practice for anyone to log on to the system as a root user, because think about it, what if that root user gets compromised? What happens is your whole system is compromised. Whoever gets access to that root user is essentially able to do anything, can bring down your computers, can access your network, can access your database, and can steal data. So you don't want to be logging into the system as root. Even if it's your development system, it's a very bad practice to log in as root. So what we do is log in as the user, and if you have access to run commands as the root, then you can make use of the sudo command, and we have used this a couple of times in the past. With sudo, it gives you the access to run commands as though you are a root user. And if you're wondering what sudo means, it means super user do. And by the way, you can also use sudo to run command as another user apart from root. It's just that root is the default behavior, so that's a configurable thing. And that's going to bring me to a new command I'm happy to introduce to you, which is su. Su means switch user. So if I did sudo su and I put my password, that's gonna make me go into the root user. And if I wanted to switch user to Peter, I can do su Peter, and if I do ID, you can see right now I'm logged in as Peter. So you can see how I have moved from Dare to root and now to Peter, and I can just do exit to go back into where I was coming from, which is root, and then another exit to go back to Dare. Alright, let me clear my screen and let's do a quick ID on Peter so I can show you a couple of things. First of all, let me show you the user ID. As you can see, Peter has a user ID of 1001, and this is the group ID which by default, if you don't specify any group when creating the user, it creates a default user in the same name of the user. And if Peter was in multiple groups, you can see here groups, it's just Peter. Now let's create a new group. Assuming Peter is a junior developer and we want to create a group, give some permissions to that group, and then assign Peter to that group. How would we do that? Sure enough, there is a command called group add, and by specifying the name of the group, let's say junior dev, and what just happened is I can't create a group with that name because Dare is not a super user on this system, and it's only a root user that can do this kind of operation. So what I would do is go back, add sudo to it to make me run this command as root, and sure enough, now we have a user called junior dev. To validate that we have indeed created this group, look at this file right here, this etc group from the error message we had previously. Well, that's the file that Linux uses to keep information about, group related things. And always remember, Linux is about files, configuration files and directories. So let's have a look into that file, and we're going to use our grep command this time to look for junior dev from etc group. And by the way, we need sudo to be able to read that file. As you can see, we have junior dev, which has a group ID of 1002. Now let's add Peter to this group because Peter is a junior dev, and to do that we need the user mod command, which is user modify, and we're going to use a couple of flags here, -a, capital G. And by the way, there's difference between capital G and small g. With a capital G, you are appending to a user to a set of groups. If I were to use small letter g, what that means is whatever group that user belonged to is going to be removed from it and added to this new group that I'm trying to add him to. But in this case, I don't want any existing group to be deleted. I just want him to be added to additional groups, and that's the reason for the capital G. And then I would specify the name of the group, junior dev, and the user. And by the way, don't forget sudo. If we check the etc group file again, now we see Peter in there. And if we do an ID on Peter, as you can see, the previous group Peter still exists, and now we have a new group. If I did a small letter g, like I was saying previously, this group would have been deleted and this would have just been added to it. How about if I wanted to delete Peter completely? Well, there's another command, user, you guessed it, del. So user mod will be to modify an existing user, user add will be to add a user, and user del will be to delete the user. So user del Peter, and don't forget to use sudo this time again, and that would have deleted Peter. If I did ID on Peter, no such user. Now the next thing I'd like to quickly talk about is relating to permission. So let me clear the screen, and where are we? pwd. Okay, let's go into desktop for Dare, and I will do an ls with more information from the inode. ls on everything. Okay, to give us some more meaning, let's create a folder. So mkdir devops dir. Okay, and an ls again. We now have that. And what I'd like to quickly talk about is the fact that we have a bunch of data coming back from the inode. Remember we talked about inode, and I want you to focus on this part. Now anything that starts with a minus represents a file. Anything that starts with a D represents a directory. And that's why I decided to create a directory, because we didn't have any directory in here before. Now, more on the rest in a bit. So I'm going to come back to this shortly. I want you to focus on this and that. Now, this one here, right here, this column represents the user, and this column represents the group. So if I were to add Dare to the junior dev group and updated the permissions on this DevOps_dir folder to give access to all the junior developers, you would have seen junior dev here, and I'm going to demonstrate that shortly, don't worry. Now back to the permissions on the left. So I talked about minus and D. What I'd like to do is copy all of this, paste, oops, copy all of this, paste, and separate them. You see, what happens is, let's remove this first one, because this very first one here, like I said before, is just a representation of what type of resource it is. It is a file or a directory. So I'm going to remove that, because now we know that's a file. But this bunch of RWX is just a representation of 3 types of users. And the first set is for user, meaning the context of the currently logged on user. And the next one is the context of the group, and the last one is the context of the others, so we call it others. So for now, just know that the very first column, when you do an ls with more data, relates to the permissions and what type of resource it is. Again, just to emphasize, minus represents a file, D represents a directory, like you can see already, and RWX represents read, write, and execute based on, is it a user or a group or others. And I'm going to go deeper into all of this in the next video. So I'm going to stop right here so that you can adjust yourself and absorb all the information so far. If you need to go back, grab a cup of coffee, do that while I get you into the part 2 of this video. I hope this has been informative for you. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification button to get updates every time. See you in the next video.